The experts arrived just after sunrise. 3 white trucks rolled slowly through the iron gate of the Ward farm, their tires pressing fresh tracks into a road that had not seen official visitors in years. Beyond the gate, the countryside looked exhausted. The surrounding hills had faded to the color of old rope. Pastures that should have been green were brittle and yellow. Creeks had narrowed into dark lines between exposed stones. Even the wind felt dry, carrying dust instead of the smell of grass. It was the worst summer the county had seen in decades. Yet halfway up the Ward hillside, rows of pear trees stood beneath the morning light. Their leaves were green, not pale green, not the weak, curled green of trees barely clinging to life. They were deep, healthy, almost defiant. Small golden pears hung from the branches. Dr. Marcus Bell stepped out of the first truck and stared at them without closing the door behind him. 3 years earlier, he had stood on this same hill with a soil report in his hand and told the Ward family that an orchard here would never survive. The slope was too exposed. The soil was too shallow, the clay beneath it was too compacted, and there was not enough reliable rainfall to support trees with deep roots. His conclusion had been printed in black ink across the final page. Long-term agricultural restoration is economically impractical. The bank had translated those words more simply. The farm was finished. Now Bell walked toward the orchard without speaking. 2 county agricultural officers followed him. Behind them came a bank representative wearing shoes that were already collecting dust. At the edge of the first row stood Elena Ward. She wore a faded denim shirt, work gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat, darkened by years of sun. At 27, she looked younger than everyone in the group, but nothing in the way she stood suggested uncertainty. Her father waited several yards behind her, leaning against an old wooden fence. Thomas Ward said nothing. He had waited too long for this moment to interrupt it. Bell reached the first pear tree and placed one hand against its trunk. The bark was cool. He looked toward the irrigation pipes but saw none running between the rows. "Where is the main water line?" he asked. Elena pointed toward a small storage tank near the barn. "That's all?" "That's all." Bell looked back at the orchard. The tank was too small to support this many trees through a summer like this. He knew it. The county officers knew it. Even the banker seemed to understand that something did not add up. One of the officers knelt and brushed aside the layer of straw and dry leaves surrounding the nearest tree. The soil beneath was dark. He pressed 2 fingers into it. Then he looked up. "It's still moist." No one answered. Outside the orchard, the exposed ground was cracked hard enough to turn away a shovel. Inside it, the soil held together in soft, dark clumps. Bell took a narrow metal probe from his truck and pushed it into the earth. It went down 12 inches, then 18, then nearly 2 feet before meeting serious resistance. He pulled it out and stared at the dark soil clinging to the metal. "That isn't possible," the banker said quietly. Elena heard him. She had heard those words before. Not possible. Too dry. Too damaged. Too expensive. Too late. 3 years earlier, the experts had used those words to describe nearly every part of the Ward farm. Now they used them to describe the evidence beneath their own boots. Bell walked several steps downhill. The ground curved gently between the rows. At first glance it looked natural, but then he noticed that the curves followed the shape of the hillside instead of running directly down it. Shallow channels rested beneath grasses and flowering plants. They were not deep enough to resemble ditches, and they did not carry water away from the orchard. They appeared designed to stop it. Bell followed one of the channels until he reached a low, stone-lined opening. "An overflow point," he said. Elena nodded. "You built this?" "Not exactly." Bell turned toward her. "What does that mean?" "I stopped forcing the water to leave." A gust of wind moved through the trees. The pear leaves shifted together, creating a soft sound that seemed impossible against the silent, burned landscape beyond the fence. Bell looked down the hill. 3 years ago, this slope had been bare in long sections. Every heavy rain carved fresh scars through the soil. Water rushed across the hardened surface, carrying mud toward the county road. The report had treated that runoff as proof that the land could not retain water. Elena had seen something different, but she was not ready to explain it yet. She walked to the oldest tree in the orchard, removed a shovel from where it rested against the trunk, and pushed the blade into the earth. It entered easily. She turned over a block of soil. Fine roots threaded through it. Beetles moved beneath the surface. A small earthworm curled away from the sudden light. The county officer beside Belle crouched down. "There were almost no worms in our original samples," he said. "There was almost no food for them," Elena replied. Belle examined the open hole. The upper layer was rich and loose. Beneath it lay the same red-brown clay described in his report, but thin roots had begun passing through narrow cracks in it. The soil had not disappeared. The clay had not been replaced. The rainfall had not doubled, and yet the land was behaving differently. "This is the same field?" Belle asked. Elena looked toward the dry hill beyond the orchard. "It's the same dirt," she paused. "Not the same system." For the first time that morning, Thomas Ward smiled. It was a small expression, almost hidden beneath his gray beard, but Elena saw it. 3 years earlier, her father had been ready to sign away everything his family had worked for: the barn, the pasture, the farmhouse built by Elena's grandfather, even the rusted rain gauge that had stood beside the kitchen window for more than half a century. The gauge had always recorded rain, but the fields had continued to die. That contradiction had become the first clue. While the experts studied annual rainfall averages, Elena had watched what happened during the first 10 minutes of a storm. While the bank studied past yields, she followed a narrow strip of green grass across a dying hillside. And while everyone else saw land that could not hold water, she began to suspect that the land had never been given the chance. Belle stood and wiped the soil from his hands. "How much of the orchard survived the heat?" "Elena?" one of the officers asked again when she did not immediately answer. She looked along the rows. 83%. The banker released a short breath. Belle frowned. "What happened to the rest?" "They died." Her answer surprised him. There was no attempt to hide the losses, no claim that she had discovered a miracle. Elena pointed toward the upper section of the orchard, where several empty spaces broke the otherwise orderly rows. The highest ground dried first. 2 overflow points were too small. One section was planted before the soil was ready. "So the system failed?" "Parts of it did." She met his eyes. "But it failed slowly enough for us to learn from it." Belle looked again at the living trees. That sentence unsettled him more than any boast could have, because serious farming was not about creating systems that never failed. It was about building systems that revealed why they were failing before everything was lost. The banker opened the folder beneath his arm. "We're here to determine whether the property now supports a revised valuation." Thomas stepped away from the fence. 3 years earlier, the bank had valued the farm primarily as distressed land. Today, buyers had begun asking about its fruit, its nursery trees, and the methods Elena had used to restore the hillside. But the banker still wanted proof. Not green leaves, not family stories, not hope. Proof. Elena picked up the shovel and walked toward the next row. "You won't find the answer in the trees," she said. Belle followed her. "Then where will we find it?" She stopped beside a shallow depression covered with clover. For several seconds she listened to the wind. Then she pointed toward the ground. "Underneath what your report stopped measuring. 3 years earlier, before the orchard, before the living soil, and before anyone believed the Ward farm could be saved, that ground had been hard, bare, and running out of time. And Elena Ward had only one season to prove that the experts had misunderstood it. 3 years earlier, rain struck the Ward farmhouse after months of dry weather. It should have been a relief. Instead, Thomas Ward stood at the kitchen window and watched muddy water race across his fields. Less than 20 minutes after the storm began, the hardened soil was already overflowing. Water followed tractor tracks, cut through the lower field, and carried loose topsoil toward the county road. Elena placed her grandfather's old rain gauge on the windowsill. "Almost an inch," she said. Thomas watched the brown water disappear downhill. "By noon, most of it will be in the ditch." The farm did receive rain. It simply could not keep it. A white county vehicle entered the yard at 9 that morning. A second car followed behind it. The bank had ordered an agricultural assessment after the Ward family missed 2 loan payments. Officially, the inspection would determine whether the farm could support a restructured loan. Thomas believed the bank had already decided to sell it. Dr. Marcus Bell introduced himself as the lead agricultural consultant. With him were Rachel Moore, a county soil specialist, and Daniel Price, the bank representative responsible for the Ward account. Belle shook Thomas's hand, then glanced at Elena. "My daughter," Thomas said. "Elena Ward. Do you help with the operation?" Belle asked. "I work here." Belle gave a polite nod and turned back to Thomas. Elena recognized the reaction. To him, she was the farmer's daughter, not the person whose observations might change the assessment. The group began in the lower field. Rachel pushed a metal soil probe into the ground. It stopped after only a few inches. She shifted her weight and tried again. "Severe compaction," she said. Years of heavy equipment had compressed the soil beneath the cultivated surface. Crop roots could not penetrate deeply. When heavy rain arrived, the upper layer became saturated, while the water underneath had nowhere to go. Belle examined the erosion channels crossing the field. "How long have these been forming?" 2 years, Thomas answered. "I filled the largest one twice." "It reopened," Elena said, "because the water still follows the same path." Belle looked toward her. "What path?" Elena pointed uphill. "It comes down through the wheel tracks, turns near the old fence, and crosses that green strip." The surrounding pasture was brown, but a narrow line of grass below the fence remained noticeably greener. "It could be an area where runoff collects," Belle said. "Or where the soil is deeper," Elena replied. "Possibly. Have you tested it?" Belle looked at the soil map in his folder. "The central fields represent the farm's main production conditions." The answer was reasonable, but it revealed the limitation of the assessment. The experts were measuring whether the farm could continue operating as it had before. Elena was beginning to wonder whether continuing the old system was the problem. They climbed to the exposed upper field. There were few trees to slow the wind or protect the soil. Most had been removed decades earlier to make room for machinery and annual crops. Belle asked Thomas about previous harvests, fertilizer costs, fuel expenses, and equipment debt. The answers followed the same pattern: 3 poor growing seasons, falling yields, rising costs, no remaining profit. "What are you planning to plant next year?" Belle asked. "Maybe sorghum," Thomas said. "Something that can handle the heat." "With the current debt?" Thomas's face tightened. "I know what I owe." Belle lowered his notebook. "I am not criticizing you. I need to determine whether the current production model is financially viable." "And if it isn't?" Thomas asked. Daniel Price opened his folder. "The bank may recommend selling the property or liquidating its assets." Elena looked toward the farmhouse, the leaning barn, and the fields her family had worked for generations. To the bank, they were assets. To her father, they were his entire life. Belle surveyed the hillside. "The property may retain some value for limited grazing or resale," he said, "but restoring it as productive farmland would require substantial time and capital." "You haven't examined every part of it," Elena said. Thomas turned toward her. "Elena," she continued, "the old fence line stays green after the rest of the field dries. The runoff changes direction there. There are willow stumps near the lower slope." Rachel looked toward the narrow green strip. "Local variations are possible." "Then why are you evaluating the whole farm as if every acre behaves the same?" "Because management decisions must be based on the dominant conditions," Belle said. "The dominant conditions may have been created by how the land has been managed." A short silence followed. Thomas stepped between them. "They came here to assess the property, not debate theories." Belle did not appear offended. "Her question is valid," he said, "but isolated areas of better soil would not solve the farm's main problems." He listed them clearly: low organic matter, compacted soil, poor infiltration, high erosion risk, insufficient income, limited time before the debt became unmanageable. Elena could not argue with any of them. That was what made the situation dangerous. Belle was not dismissing the farm because he was careless. He was drawing a logical conclusion from the evidence in front of him. But Elena suspected that the evidence described the farm's past more accurately than its full potential. For the next several hours, the team collected soil samples, measured slopes, and photographed erosion damage. Elena followed with her notebook. She recorded every location they tested. She also recorded the places they ignored: the old hedgerow, the narrow green strip, the willow stumps, the soil beneath years of fallen leaves near the woodland edge. 2 weeks later, the report arrived. Thomas left the envelope on the kitchen table for nearly an hour before opening it. The report contained 47 pages of maps, photographs, and laboratory results. The findings were direct. The cultivated fields had shallow topsoil, organic matter was low, the subsoil was heavily compacted. Water infiltration was poor. Erosion risk was high. Under the existing system, future crop income was unlikely to cover operating costs and debt. Near the final page, one sentence summarized the farm's prospects. Long-term agricultural restoration is economically impractical under current site conditions. The report recommended ending annual crop production and preparing the property for sale. Thomas read the sentence twice. Then he pushed the report toward Elena. "My father kept this place through droughts, floods, and 2 bankrupt neighbors," he said. "I'll be the one who loses it. You didn't cause the weather. I borrowed against the farm, to keep it operating. And now the bank gets it anyway." Elena turned back through the report. The measurements were real. She did not intend to deny them, but one phrase stayed in her mind. Under current site conditions. Conditions were not permanent. They could worsen. They could also be changed. She placed the modern soil map beside an old aerial photograph of the farm. The official map divided the property into broad soil zones. It showed the dominant characteristics of the land, but not every small variation across the hillside. In the old photograph, a dark line crossed the north field. It followed the same route as the green grass Elena had noticed. Several mature willows once stood near its lower end. That did not prove there was a hidden spring or a reliable source of groundwater, but it suggested that this part of the farm had once held moisture differently. Elena wrote one sentence in her notebook. "Find out why the green line survives." Thomas put on his coat. "I'm going to speak with Price." "About what?" "Selling the north field first. It may cover part of the loan. That field contains the green strip. It contains brush, broken fence, and soil that hasn't produced anything in years. We don't know why it stopped producing." Thomas looked at her. "I have farmed this ground for 36 years. You know how we've been farming it." His expression hardened. "You think this happened because I failed?" "No. I think the system failed." "There is no system, Elena. There is soil, weather, and debt. And every time it rains, water leaves this farm within an hour, because the ground won't absorb it." "Then that is the first problem we should solve." Thomas shook his head. "With what money?" "My savings. That money is for your future. This farm is part of my future. You don't have a plan." "I have a place to begin." Elena pointed to the old photograph. "The experts tested the center of the damaged fields. I want to test the places that still behave differently. And if those places mean nothing, then we stop." Thomas remained silent. "Give me 1 season," Elena said. "Let me use the north field and a small section of the lower slope. The bank won't wait forever. Ask for 1 final season before selling." "And if you fail?" Elena looked at the report. "Then I will accept their conclusion." Outside, another thin stream of rainwater crossed the yard and flowed toward the road. Elena picked up the cracked rain gauge. "We keep measuring how much rain falls," she said. "Nobody is measuring how long it stays." Thomas watched the water leaving the farm. He did not believe her idea would work, but for the first time, he looked uncertain about the report. "1 season," he said. "1 season," Elena repeated. "You do not borrow against the house." "I won't. You begin small." "Yes. And if the land becomes dangerous, you stop." Elena nodded. Thomas pulled the final report toward him. At the bottom of the last page was a blank line for his signature. He closed the document without signing it. The experts had measured the soil's damage, the farm's debt, and the failure of its crops. Elena did not believe their measurements were wrong. She believed they had stopped measuring too soon. The next morning, Elena began with stakes, string, and a notebook. She did not have money for surveying equipment or laboratory tests. She had 1 season, a small section of land and permission that could disappear the moment her father believed the work had become too risky. She started at the old fence line. The narrow strip of green grass was easy to see from the upper field. It crossed the brown hillside in a shallow curve before disappearing beneath brush near the woods. Elena placed a wooden stake every 20 yards. At each point, she recorded 3 things: how green the plants were, how hard the ground felt, how deep she could push a metal rod into the soil. In the cultivated field, the rod stopped after several inches. Along the green strip, it went deeper. Not everywhere, but often enough to form a pattern. Thomas watched from the tractor shed. "You'll need more than that to prove anything," he said. "I know. What exactly are you looking for?" "I don't know yet." "That is not a reassuring answer." Elena pulled the rod from the ground. I'm looking for why this part behaves differently. Her father glanced toward the brown field. Maybe water runs through it after a storm. Then the soil should be more eroded. Maybe the weeds have deeper roots. Then I need to know which weeds. Thomas shook his head. You always answered questions with more questions. That's how you find the useful one. He left her to work. By noon, Elena had marked the entire green line. It was not straight. It followed the shape of the hillside, curving gently around the slope instead of descending toward the road. That mattered. Water moving downhill usually followed the steepest path. This strip seemed to follow a level line across the land. Elena returned to the farmhouse and spread the old aerial photograph beside the modern soil map. The dark line in the photograph matched the stakes she had placed that morning. It had once been bordered by trees and brush. Her grandfather had removed most of them when the farm expanded its crop fields. Elena needed someone who remembered what the land looked like before that change. She drove 3 miles north to the home of Walter Hayes. Walter was 81 and had lived beside the Ward farm since childhood. He opened the door wearing work trousers and a shirt stained with machine oil. "You look like your mother," he said. "I'm here to ask about my grandfather. That makes you sound like a bill collector." She showed him the photograph. Walter adjusted his glasses. That was taken before they widened the lower field. Elena pointed to the dark curve. What was here? Fence, mostly. Blackberries. A few willows. Was it a creek? No. A spring? Not that I remember. Then why were the willows there? Walter studied the image again. That strip stayed wet longer than the rest. Because water collected there? Sometimes. But your grandfather said the hill had a seam. Elena looked up. What kind of seam? He never explained it scientifically, said the ground changed along that line. Did he plant there? Not crops. He left it alone. Why? Walter smiled. Because his horses told him to. Elena waited. When they plowed the upper field, the horses slowed near that line, Walter explained. The soil was softer, machines didn't notice it the same way. It was not proof, but it was another observation pointing to the same place. Before Elena left, Walter gave her a rusted hand auger that had belonged to his father. It won't tell you what the experts missed, he said, but it may tell you where to dig. That afternoon, Elena took soil samples from both sides of the green strip. In the field above it, the upper soil was thin and dry. Beneath it, the auger reached dense red clay. Inside the strip, the first sample looked similar. The second contained darker soil. The third brought up fine roots and fragments of decomposed wood. At the fourth location, the auger dropped suddenly several inches. Elena stopped turning. The ground beneath her was softer than the surrounding field. She widened the hole with a shovel. At 8 inches, she found dark soil mixed with small stones. At 14 inches, the soil was still slightly cool. There was no pool of water, no hidden spring, no miraculous underground river, but the soil profile was deeper and better protected than the field around it. Years of roots, leaf litter, and undisturbed vegetation had created a narrow zone that absorbed water more effectively. Elena marked the location in her notebook. Then she dug 5 more holes. The pattern continued. The green strip was not surviving because it received more rain. It survived because its soil had been disturbed less, covered longer, and allowed to build deeper roots. The rest of the field had lost those advantages. That evening, Thomas found 6 open holes across the north slope. He stood beside the deepest one. "You planning to bury something?" "Maybe the report." He did not smile. Elena handed him 2 clumps of soil. One came from the cultivated field. It was pale, dense, and broke into hard pieces. The other came from the old fence line. It was darker and held together around fine roots. Thomas turned them over in his hands. "They are 50 feet apart," Elena said. "I can see that. The report treats them as the same soil zone. The map cannot show every difference. That's my point. It does not mean the whole farm can become this. No, but it means this land can hold water under the right conditions." Thomas looked toward the stakes. "What conditions?" "Cover, roots, organic matter, less disturbance." "And how long did it take the fence line to build that?" "Probably years." "We have 1 season." Elena nodded. She had reached the same problem. The green strip showed what was possible, but it did not show how to reproduce it quickly enough to save the farm. She needed a smaller objective. Not restore every acre, not build an orchard, not prove every expert wrong. She only needed to show measurable change in one controlled section. The next morning, she selected a half-acre plot beside the green strip. One side would remain untreated. On the other, she planned to slow runoff, protect the surface, and introduce deep-rooted cover plants. Thomas studied the boundary she had marked. "You are not planting trees yet?" "No. I thought trees were the plan." "They are. Then why wait?" "Because planting trees into damaged soil will only prove the experts right." That answer earned his attention. Elena pointed to the untreated field. "First, I need to prove we can keep water here longer than it stays now." "How will you measure that?" "Soil moisture after rain, infiltration time, surface temperature, plant survival." "With what equipment?" "Buckets, metal rings, a thermometer, and the moisture meter from the greenhouse." Thomas looked doubtful, but he did not stop her. Elena spent the next week building a basic test. She pressed 2 open metal rings into the soil, one inside the green strip and one in the damaged field. She poured the same amount of water into each. In the green strip, the water sank gradually into the ground. In the field, it remained on the surface, then escaped through a crack in the ring. She repeated the test. The result was nearly the same. The difference was not rainfall, it was infiltration. That night, she wrote the first clear conclusion in her notebook. The farm does not only need more water, the soil needs more time to receive it. She then drew a shallow curved line across the half-acre plot. It followed the hillside rather than running down it. The line was not yet a ditch. It was only the beginning of an idea. Slow the water before it gathered enough speed to carry soil away. Walter's story about the horses had shown her where to look. The soil samples had shown her what the land could become. Now she needed to prove that she could reproduce the effect deliberately. From the barn, Thomas watched his daughter drive another stake into the hillside. The bank saw a farmer's daughter delaying an inevitable sale. The experts saw someone without the resources to change damaged land. Elena saw a narrow green line that had survived everything around it, and for the first time she understood what it was trying to tell her. Elena's first goal was simple: find out how the green strip slowed water. She began by measuring the slope with clear tubing, 2 wooden stakes and water. One end of the tube was fixed to the first stake. She carried the other end across the hillside until the water inside rested at the same height on both sides. That point was level with the first. She marked it and repeated the process. By the end of the day, the stakes formed a gentle curve across the field. They followed the green strip almost exactly. The result confirmed what Elena had suspected. The strip did not run downhill like a stream. It followed the contour of the land. Vegetation, roots, and years of accumulated organic matter had created a narrow barrier across the slope. During rain, it slowed surface water long enough for part of it to enter the soil. The cultivated field above it behaved differently. Its surface was exposed and compacted. Water gained speed as it moved downhill, entered the tractor tracks, and carried soil away. The green strip did not receive more rain. It gave the rain more time. Elena showed the curved line of stakes to Thomas. The water reaches this area and slows down. Because of the brush? Partly. The roots hold the soil, and the surface is rough enough to interrupt the flow. Thomas looked toward the eroded channel below the field. "And you think we can copy that?" "On a small scale. With another fence? Without the fence." Her plan was to build a shallow depression along the contour line. It would not function as a pond or a drainage ditch. Its purpose was to spread runoff across the slope and prevent it from concentrating in one place. Thomas studied the marked line. "How deep?" "No more than a few inches at first." "Where does the water go when it fills?" Elena pointed toward the lowest end. "We build an overflow point there. And if you are wrong about the level, the water may collect at one end, or break through it." Elena nodded. "That is why we start with half an acre." Thomas was still unconvinced, but her answer was cautious enough that he agreed to help. They used hand tools instead of the tractor. Elena did not want heavy machinery compacting the test plot further. She also wanted to see the soil structure as they worked. The top layer came away in dry blocks. Beneath it, the clay was hard enough to ring against the shovel. Near the green strip, however, roots entered narrow cracks in the subsoil. Some channels extended deeper than Elena expected. She placed part of the excavated soil on the downhill side, creating a low berm. Then she covered the disturbed surface with straw to protect it from direct rain. Thomas watched her spread the final layer. That will not fix compacted clay. No? Then what does it fix? It gives the water somewhere to pause. Elena divided the half-acre into 2 sections. The first remained unchanged. In the second she added 3 elements: a shallow contour depression to slow runoff, straw and old hay to protect the surface, a mixture of rye, clover, and deep-rooted forage plants. She chose the plants for function rather than harvest. Some would cover exposed ground quickly. Others would send roots into the compacted layer. When those roots died, they could leave small channels for water, air, and future roots. It was not an instant transformation. It was the beginning of a biological process. Thomas looked at the seed mixture. We cannot sell any of this. Not this season? Then how does it help the loan? If the soil cannot support roots, it cannot support a profitable crop. He handed the seed bag back to her. You are spending money to grow something we will not harvest. I am spending money to rebuild what the previous crops were growing in. Thomas said nothing more. Elena installed simple markers in both plots. After each rain, she would record how long water remained on the surface, how deep moisture could be detected, how much soil collected at the bottom of the slope, how quickly the ground dried, whether the new plants survived. For 12 days, no rain came. The straw moved in the wind. Birds ate part of the seed. Several afternoons of intense heat dried the upper soil before anything germinated. Thomas passed the plot each morning without commenting. On the 13th day, the sky darkened. Elena stood near the barn as the first drops struck the roof. Within minutes, rain fell hard enough to blur the upper field. Water began moving across the exposed soil. In the untreated plot, it gathered quickly in the old wheel tracks and ran downhill in narrow brown streams. In the treated section, the straw absorbed the first impact. Runoff moved more slowly toward the shallow contour depression. The channel began to fill. Elena walked beside it in the rain, checking the water level against the stakes. At first the flow spread evenly. Then the western end began rising faster. Thomas saw it at the same moment. That side is too low. Elena moved toward it. Water had started concentrating near the end of the berm. If the level continued to rise, it could cut through the loose soil and send the entire volume downhill. She opened the planned overflow point with a shovel. A controlled stream moved through the stone-lined gap and entered a grass-covered area below. The berm held. Elena stepped back, soaked through and breathing hard. Thomas watched the water leave through the overflow. That was close. The level is wrong by a few inches. A few inches is enough. I know. The storm lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the difference between the 2 plots was visible. The untreated section had developed fresh channels. Mud had collected near the lower fence. The treated section was not undamaged. Some straw had shifted, and one edge of the shallow depression had begun to erode. But most of the water had spread across the contour line instead of rushing directly downhill. Elena waited until the next morning before checking the soil. The untreated surface had already begun forming a hard crust. Under the straw, the ground remained soft. She pushed the moisture probe into both sections. In the untreated plot, moisture was concentrated near the surface. In the treated plot, the reading remained higher several inches below it. Thomas stood beside her as she recorded the numbers. "One storm does not prove anything," he said. "No. And the western end needs to be rebuilt." "Yes." He looked at the shallow channel. "But it slowed the water." Elena closed her notebook. "That is all I needed it to do." 5 days later, the first rye shoots appeared beneath the straw. Then came the clover. The growth was uneven, and several bare areas remained. But thin green lines began covering soil that had been exposed for years. Elena dug a small hole near one of the strongest patches. The roots were still shallow, but the soil surrounding them held together differently. It no longer broke only into hard, dry fragments. The change was small. Too small for the bank, too small for the experts, but it was measurable. Elena updated the old aerial photograph with the location of the test plot. Beside it, she wrote 3 conclusions. The slope can slow water without creating a pond. Covered soil stays moist longer than exposed soil. The system needs a safe overflow route. The third lesson mattered most. The experiment had worked, but it had also nearly failed. If the contour line had been longer, deeper, or placed above a building, the uneven level could have caused serious damage. Elena understood that observing the land was not enough. She needed to design for what would happen when the land exceeded her expectations. That evening, Thomas found her repairing the low end of the berm. "What happens next?" he asked. "We repeat the test during the next storm. And after that, if the results hold, we extend it." "To the whole field?" "No." Elena pointed toward the strongest patch of new growth. "First, we build one section of soil capable of supporting a tree." Thomas looked at the small green shoots. For the first time, the idea of an orchard did not sound impossible. It only sounded far away. Over the next 6 weeks, Elena repeated the same measurements after every rain. She compared the treated plot with the untreated field. The pattern remained consistent. In the untreated section, water pooled briefly on the surface, then escaped downhill through wheel tracks and erosion channels. By the second or third day, the upper soil had hardened again. In the treated plot, the shallow contour line slowed the runoff. Straw protected the surface, and the new roots created small openings in the soil. Moisture remained detectable for several days longer. Elena recorded each result in her notebook. The difference was not dramatic enough to impress the bank, but it was no longer an accident. Thomas joined her after a light storm one morning. Elena poured the same amount of water into 2 metal rings pressed into the ground. In the untreated field, the water remained on the surface. In the test plot, it disappeared gradually into the soil. "How long?" Thomas asked. 11 minutes here, more than 40 in the field." Thomas looked toward the hard ground above them. "So the field is not rejecting all the water." "No, it is receiving it too slowly, and the rest runs away." Elena nodded. That was the central problem. The farm's annual rainfall was limited, but the land was also losing much of what it received. Rain fell too quickly for the compacted soil to absorb it. The exposed surface became hot. Without plant cover, moisture evaporated rapidly. Shallow crop roots could not reach deeper reserves. The farm did not need a miracle source of water. It needed to make better use of the water already crossing it. Elena marked 3 additional test areas on the hillside. Each one served a different purpose. The first tested thicker ground cover. The second tested different root systems. The third tested whether a small amount of compost could improve the soil near future planting sites. She did not spread compost across the entire field. The farm could not afford it. Instead, she concentrated limited material in narrow planting zones. Thomas helped her collect old hay, spoiled feed, and manure from the barn. They built a small compost pile near the test field. At first, it remained cold. Elena checked the mixture. There was too much dry straw and not enough nitrogen-rich material. She added fresh manure, mixed the pile, and adjusted the moisture. Several days later, heat rose from its center. Thomas pushed his hand near the surface. "That is warmer than the barn. Microbes are breaking the material down. And this goes around the trees? When it is finished." He looked at the pile. "So we are not just feeding the trees. We are feeding the soil that supports them." The first major setback came during a period of intense heat. Several sections of clover died. The exposed edges of the test plot dried faster than Elena expected. A section of straw blew away, leaving the soil bare. She had assumed the early root growth would protect the ground. It was not enough. The system still depended heavily on surface cover. Elena replaced the lost mulch and added temporary windbreaks made from old fence panels. She also reduced the size of the next planting area. Every failure made the experiment less impressive. It also made the plan more realistic. By late summer, the untreated field was almost entirely brown. The test plot was not green everywhere, but the strongest sections still held living plants. Elena dug 2 holes after 12 days without rain. The first was in the open field. The topsoil was dry and hard. Beneath it, the clay remained dense. The second hole was beneath the covered section. The surface was dry, but several inches below it, the soil was cooler and slightly moist. Fine roots followed cracks into the compacted layer. Thomas crouched beside the hole. "That moisture came from the last storm?" "Yes." "Nearly 2 weeks ago?" "Yes." He touched the soil. For years he had treated dry weather as the farm's main enemy. Now he could see that the soil itself had been shortening every rainfall event. A storm that should have supported plants for days was leaving the property within hours. Elena opened her notebook and showed him the measurements. The treated plot had not received more rainfall, it had not been irrigated more often. The only difference was how the surface and soil had been managed. Thomas read the figures twice. This is enough to plant trees? Not yet. What is missing? Depth, stability, and proof that the soil can survive a full wet season without washing out. The next stage required a stronger root system. Elena planted deep-rooted forage radish in several compacted areas. Its thick roots could enter weak points in the soil. After the plants died, the decaying roots would leave channels behind. She also kept rye and clover in the mixture. The plants served different functions. Rye protected the surface and produced fibrous roots. Clover helped build ground cover and contributed nitrogen through its biological relationship with soil bacteria. The radish targeted compacted zones. No single plant would repair the field. Together, they could begin changing how it functioned. By early autumn, Elena had enough evidence to create a basic water budget for the test plot. She could not measure every drop, but she could show 3 important changes. Less water left the plot as surface runoff. The soil absorbed water faster. Moisture remained available longer beneath the covered ground. She wrote a sentence at the top of the final page. The land was not empty of water. It was losing water faster than it could use it. Thomas read it from over her shoulder. That sounds different from saying the farm is not dry. It is still dry. Then what are you saying? That dry land and damaged water movement are not the same problem. She pointed toward the test field. We cannot control how much rain arrives. Then she pointed toward the shallow contour line, the covered soil and the plants still alive beneath the afternoon sun. But we can change what happens after it falls. Thomas remained quiet. The idea had moved beyond theory. It was now supported by repeated observations. But one small plot would not save the farm. The bank wanted income. The land needed years. Elena had only months. She looked toward the upper slope, where the first orchard would have to stand. The next decision would cost real money. She could continue studying the soil safely, or she could plant the first trees and risk proving the experts right. Elena decided to plant 12 pear trees. Not an orchard. Not yet. 12 trees were enough to test whether the restored soil could support deep roots, but few enough that one failure would not destroy the farm. She chose an old pear variety known for hardiness and grafted it onto stronger rootstock. The trees were planted across 3 conditions: 4 in untreated soil, 4 in the improved test plot, 4 near the old green strip. Each tree received the same amount of water. The difference would come from the soil around it. Thomas helped dig the planting holes. In the untreated field, the shovel struck hard clay after a few inches. Elena made the first hole wider. Thomas stopped her. You are making a basin. It will give the roots loose soil. It may also collect water around the trunk. She examined the hole. He was right. In dense clay, a deep hole filled with softer soil could behave like a container. Water might enter faster than it could leave, leaving the roots trapped in saturated ground. Elena changed the design. She loosened a wider, shallower area instead of digging deeper. She planted each tree slightly above the surrounding grade and covered the soil with mulch, keeping it away from the trunk. When they finished, the 12 young trees looked fragile against the open hillside. Thomas leaned on his shovel. You believe these will become an orchard? I believe they will tell us whether an orchard is possible. For the first month, the results appeared promising. The trees near the green strip produced new leaves first. Those in the improved plot followed. The untreated trees survived, but their growth was slower. Their leaves curled during hot afternoons, even when Elena gave them the same amount of water. She began measuring soil moisture beside each tree. The pattern matched her earlier tests. Covered, rooted soil stayed cooler and held moisture longer. Then the weather changed. A slow-moving storm settled over the county and dropped several inches of rain in one night. Elena woke to the sound of water striking the roof. She dressed and ran outside before sunrise. The shallow contour depression above the test plot was already full. Water moved steadily through the overflow point. At first, the system appeared to be working. Then Elena noticed a second stream forming near the western end. A section of the berm had settled lower after weeks of dry weather. Water was concentrating there instead of reaching the protected overflow. She grabbed a shovel. By the time Thomas reached the field, the stream had cut a narrow opening through the loose soil. "Elena, move back!" She stepped away as the berm failed. Water burst through the opening and rushed downhill. It crossed the test plot, tore away sections of mulch, and struck the row of young trees. Two bent almost to the ground. One was pulled from the soil completely. Mud covered the lower roots of several others. Thomas and Elena worked in the rain, opening a wider path toward the grassed overflow area. They used stones, boards, and old fence posts to redirect the flow. It took less than 10 minutes for the damage to happen. By sunrise, the storm had weakened. The hillside was silent except for water dripping from the trees. The test plot looked nothing like it had the day before. Mulch had collected against the fence. The shallow contour line was broken in 2 places. 3 trees leaned at sharp angles. The uprooted pear lay 20 yards downhill. Thomas stood beside it. "We should have stopped with the soil test." Elena did not answer. She walked through the damaged plot and recorded what she saw. The treated soil had absorbed more water than the exposed field, but the structure meant to slow the runoff had failed when the flow concentrated in the wrong place. Her idea had not failed because slowing water was impossible. It had failed because she had not provided enough safe capacity for excess water. Thomas picked up the uprooted tree. "I warned you a few inches could matter." "I know. This was half an acre." "I know. What happens if you build it above the barn?" "I won't." "What happens if the next storm is larger?" Elena looked at the broken berm. "The same thing, unless I change the design." Thomas dropped the tree beside the fence. "The bank is not going to finance experiments that wash themselves downhill. They are not financing this." "No, you are spending everything you saved." Elena finally looked at him. "I made a mistake. A dangerous one." "Yes." Her answer stopped him. She did not defend the damage or blame the storm. The water had behaved according to the slope. The structure had behaved according to its weakest point. The failure belonged to the design. They spent the morning lifting the damaged trees. 2 had broken roots and could not be saved. A third had lost most of its soil but remained intact. Elena replanted it in the protected section near the green strip. Of the 12 trees, 10 remained. By the end of the week, another one began to decline. Elena removed it before disease or rot could spread. 9 trees survived. The loss was small compared with a full orchard, but the message was clear. Her system could not simply hold water. It had to release excess water safely. She returned to the contour line and measured every section again. The western end was lower than the main overflow by less than 4 inches. During light rain, the difference barely mattered. During the storm, it determined where the entire system failed. Elena redesigned the trial. She shortened each contour section. She added multiple broad overflow points instead of relying on one narrow outlet. She protected them with dense grass and stone. She reduced the height of the berm so it could not store a dangerous volume of water. Most importantly, she stopped thinking of the system as a structure designed to capture every drop. Its purpose was to slow water, spread it, and allow the excess to continue downhill without causing damage. Walter Hayes visited while she was repairing the field. He examined the broken section. "You tried to make the hill obey you," he said. "I tried to keep the water from leaving. Water always leaves eventually." Elena looked toward the lower field. "Then the goal is to decide how it leaves." Walter nodded. "And how much good it does before it goes." That sentence changed the way Elena understood the project. The farm did not need to trap all its rainfall. It needed to use the time between arrival and departure. 2 weeks later, another storm reached the hillside. The rainfall was lighter, but strong enough to test the repairs. Elena and Thomas watched from the upper field. Water entered the first shallow contour section. It spread across the curve, slowed, and moved through a wide grass-covered outlet. Farther downhill, the next section repeated the process. No single structure carried enough water to become dangerous. The system did not stop the flow. It broke one fast stream into several slower movements. When the storm ended, the repaired plot remained intact. Thomas inspected the overflow points. "This is less impressive than the first version. It is safer. It holds less water. It spreads more of it." He pushed his boot into the wet soil. "And if one section fails, the others can still work." That was the lesson Elena had nearly missed. A resilient farm could not depend on one perfect structure, one crop or one storm. It needed layers, small systems, safe failures. Enough flexibility to survive mistakes without losing everything. Elena looked at the remaining pear trees. 9 were still alive. 3 deaths would appear in her records as a loss, but they had prevented her from planting hundreds of trees into a dangerous design. The first failure had cost her savings, time, and confidence. It had also taught her the rule that would later save the orchard. Water should never be given only one path. After the failure, Elena stopped expanding. For 3 weeks, she only observed. She walked the hillside after every rain, marking where water slowed, where it gathered, and where it cut into the soil. She compared those paths with the old fence line, the surviving pear trees and the sections where cover crops remained green longest. The pattern became clear. The farm did not need one large structure. It needed many small interruptions placed where the landscape could safely receive them. Elena divided the slope into short sections. Each section had 3 parts: a shallow contour line to slow runoff, a wide grass-covered outlet for excess water, a protected planting zone below it. The new lines were lower and shorter than her first design. They could not store enough water to become dangerous. If one overflowed, the water would move into the next section rather than rush directly toward the barn. Thomas helped her check every level. This time they measured twice before moving soil. At one location, the contour line appeared correct until Thomas stepped 20 yards downhill and looked back. "The western end still drops," he said. Elena checked again. He was right. The difference was less than 2 inches. She moved the stake. The failed berm had taught them that small errors became large once water started moving. They rebuilt the damaged section by hand. Instead of leaving loose soil exposed, Elena seeded the berm immediately with rye and clover. She placed stones at the overflow points and covered the planting zones with compost and old hay. The materials served different purposes. The stones protected the outlets from erosion. The plants held the surface together. The mulch reduced evaporation. The compost fed soil organisms near the future tree roots. Elena also changed the way she planted. She no longer prepared isolated holes in hard clay. Each future tree received a wider zone of improved soil connected to surrounding vegetation. The roots would not be trapped inside a small pocket. They would have several directions in which to grow. Of the 9 surviving pear trees, the 4 nearest the green strip remained strongest. 3 in the treated plot recovered slowly. Only 2 in the untreated soil continued growing. Elena did not remove the weaker trees. They were part of the experiment. Every 2 weeks, she measured new growth and checked moisture beside each trunk. The difference widened through late summer. The trees in exposed soil needed water first. Those surrounded by mulch, cover crops, and the redesigned contour system showed less leaf curl during hot afternoons. Thomas noticed before Elena mentioned it. "The upper 2 are struggling again," he said. "They dry faster, but they receive the same amount of water." "Yes." He looked toward the healthier trees. "So the difference is not what you gave them. It is how long the soil kept it." That was the proof Elena had been trying to build. Not that she could eliminate drought, not that damaged land could be restored instantly, only that the same rainfall produced different results when the soil surface, roots, and water flow were managed together. The next storm arrived at night. It was shorter than the storm that had destroyed the first berm, but heavy enough to send water across the field. Elena and Thomas walked the slope with flashlights. The first contour section filled gradually. Water spread along its curve, then passed through the broad overflow without cutting the soil. Downhill, the second section received the flow and slowed it again. At the lowest section, the water entered a grass-covered path leading away from the orchard site. No berm failed. No single channel carried the full force of the storm. By morning, the untreated field showed fresh erosion. The redesigned area remained intact. Elena dug beneath the mulch. The soil was moist several inches down. Near the untreated trees, the surface was already beginning to crust. Thomas pushed the shovel into the improved section. The blade entered with less resistance than it had earlier in the season. "This soil is changing," he said. "A small part of it. How much can you prepare before winter?" Elena looked across the slope. "With the materials we have, maybe 2 acres. That is not much of an orchard." It is enough for the first permanent block. Thomas considered the surviving trees. 3 months earlier, he had expected all of them to die. Now 6 were growing well enough to justify another test. How many trees? He asked. 40. He looked at her. You started with 12 and lost 3, which is why 40 sounds ambitious. It is also why the design is safer now. Thomas did not agree immediately. He walked to the old green strip and pressed his boot into the soil. Then he looked at the repaired contour lines below it. The pattern was beginning to resemble the landscape that had existed before the fields were cleared. Not a copy of the old fence, not a return to the past. A new system built from the same principle. Slow the water, protect the soil, keep living roots in the ground, give excess water a safe way out. Thomas picked up one of the unused stakes. Show me where the next line goes. Elena walked ahead of him. For the first time, her father was no longer helping her test an idea. He was helping her build the orchard. By early autumn, Elena had prepared 2 acres for the first orchard block. She planted 40 young pear trees across the restored slope. The trees received no special irrigation system. Elena used only the small storage tank near the barn and watered each tree carefully during the driest weeks. The real test was whether the soil could keep that water long enough for the roots to survive. For several weeks, little changed. The trees remained small. The cover crops grew unevenly. From the road, the field still looked like an unfinished experiment. Then the rain stopped. A dry period settled over the county. Pastures turned yellow, ponds dropped, and farmers began hauling water to livestock. The exposed areas of the Ward farm hardened within days. But the restored section changed more slowly. The mulch protected the soil from direct sun. Rye and clover shaded the surface. The contour lines spread the remaining moisture across the slope instead of allowing it to collect in one place. Elena checked the trees every morning. Some leaves curled during the hottest part of the day, but most recovered by evening. After 10 days without rain, she dug beside one of the stronger trees. The top layer was dry. Several inches below it, the soil was still cool and slightly moist. Thomas crouched beside the hole. He reached down and pressed the soil between his fingers. "The field above us is already hard," he said. Elena nodded. "This section is losing water more slowly." They checked 5 more trees. The results were not identical, but the pattern remained. Trees near the protected contour lines had more moisture than those in exposed soil. Their new growth was stronger, and fewer leaves showed signs of stress. The untreated pear trees from the first experiment provided the clearest comparison. One had stopped growing, another had yellowing leaves. The trees in the improved soil were still forming new buds. Thomas looked between the 2 groups. They received the same rain, and almost the same amount of added water, Elena said, but they did not get the same result. No. For the first time, the difference was visible without a notebook or laboratory test. The soil itself had become part of the water system. A week later, Daniel Price from the bank arrived without warning. He stepped out of his car and looked across the field. "I expected more," he said. Elena did not respond. 40 young trees did not resemble a profitable orchard. There were no heavy branches, no harvest, and no income. Price walked toward the strongest row. "How many have died?" 4. "And the rest?" 36 are still alive. That does not mean they will survive winter." "No." "Or next summer?" "No." Price looked at her. "You understand the bank needs financial proof. This is biological proof. The loan is not biological." Thomas approached from the barn. "We know what the loan is." Price closed his folder. "The extension expires in 4 months. After that, the bank will review the property again." When he left, Thomas watched the car disappear down the road. "He is right about one thing," he said. "We do not have income yet." Elena looked at the young trees. She had proven that the system could keep them alive longer. Now she had to prove it could produce something worth selling. She began grafting additional pear varieties onto stronger rootstock in a small nursery beside the barn. The nursery required less land than a full orchard and could generate income sooner. Instead of waiting years for fruit, Elena could sell young trees to local growers interested in hardy varieties. Thomas helped build the first nursery beds. By winter, they had more than 100 grafted trees protected beneath straw and simple covers. It was not enough to repay the debt, but it was the first part of Elena's plan that could become a business. The orchard would prove the land could recover. The nursery could help pay for the recovery. Before the first frost, Dr. Marcus Bell returned to inspect the original test area. Elena showed him the surviving trees, the soil moisture records, and the erosion measurements. Bell studied the figures. "Your treated plot is performing better," he said. Thomas looked at Elena. It was the first time an expert had said it aloud. Bell continued, "But 2 acres do not prove the entire property can be restored." Elena expected the objection. "They do not need to." "What do they prove?" She pointed toward the orchard. "That the land was not incapable of supporting trees." Bell looked across the rows. The young orchard was still fragile. Its future was uncertain, but it existed, and according to his original report, it should not have. The bank reviewed Elena's results in early winter. She brought survival records, soil moisture measurements, and photographs showing reduced erosion across the restored section. Daniel Price read through the documents without expression. "Your trees are alive," he said. "That is not the same as a profitable farm. The nursery will begin producing saleable trees next season. Begin producing is not guaranteed income." Dr. Bell attended the meeting as an independent advisor. He acknowledged that Elena's test plot had performed better than the untreated field. The soil absorbed water more effectively, and most of the young pear trees had survived. But he would not support a full reassessment. "The results are promising," he said, "but the scale is too small." Elena understood what they were asking for. More land, more trees, more time, everything the farm had least of. Price closed the file. "The extension ends in 4 months. Unless the property shows a realistic path to revenue, the bank will begin foreclosure." Outside the meeting room, Thomas leaned against the wall. "We proved the soil could change," he said. "They want proof the farm can pay. We cannot wait years for pears." "We won't." Elena showed him the nursery plan. Instead of relying only on fruit, they would sell grafted trees, compost, and a limited number of hardy plants grown in the restored soil. The orchard would be the long-term investment. The nursery would create earlier income. Thomas studied the figures. "To make this work, we have to expand before we know whether the first block survives another summer." "Yes? And if the next planting fails, we lose the farm faster." Thomas looked through the window toward the fields. For months he had tried to protect Elena from the land. Now the land had given them one possible path forward. It was dangerous, but selling meant losing everything with certainty. "How many acres?" he asked. 6 more. "How many trees?" 120. Thomas let out a slow breath. Then he nodded. They spent the winter preparing the next section. Elena repeated the system that had worked. Short contour lines, wide overflow points, permanent ground cover, compost concentrated near planting zones, several tree varieties instead of one. She refused to depend on a single structure or crop again. When spring arrived, the nursery trees began producing new growth. A local orchard owner purchased the first 20. The payment was small, but Elena placed the receipt on the kitchen table. Thomas read it twice. "The farm made money from trees," he said. "Not enough yet." "No." He looked toward the young orchard. "But it is more than the report expected." The first sale did not save the Ward farm. It did something almost as important. It proved Elena's system could produce more than healthy soil. It could produce value. By midsummer, the Ward farm had 8 restored acres and more than 150 pear trees. Then the heat arrived. For 23 days, no rain fell. Pastures across the county turned brown. Several neighboring farms began hauling water. Elena's storage tank dropped faster than she expected. She could not save every tree, so she divided the orchard into priority zones. The youngest trees received water first. The strongest trees received less. The weakest trees on the highest ground were left to survive on stored soil moisture alone. Thomas objected. "We planted all of them, and we do not have enough water for all of them. You are choosing which ones die. I am choosing which ones give the orchard a future." The decision was painful but necessary. Some trees failed within 2 weeks. Others stopped growing but remained alive. The trees in the best-covered soil held on longest. Their leaves curled during the hottest afternoons, then recovered overnight. Beneath the mulch, the soil stayed cooler than the exposed ground nearby. Elena continued recording everything: tree survival, soil temperature, moisture depth, water use. She did not hide the losses. When Dr. Bell returned near the end of the dry period, he found several empty spaces in the upper rows. "How many did you lose?" he asked. 21. Out of 156. Bell looked across the orchard. Most of the remaining trees were still green. No additional water source? Only the tank. And rainfall? None in more than 3 weeks. He dug beside one of the surviving trees. The surface was dry, but the soil beneath still held slight moisture. The system had not defeated the drought. It had stretched limited water far enough to keep most of the orchard alive. That distinction mattered. A few days later, clouds gathered over the county. The rain came hard and fast. Elena and Thomas walked the orchard as water entered the contour lines. The overflow points released it safely. No berm failed. No new erosion channel formed. The restored soil absorbed part of the storm, while the excess moved slowly downhill. By morning, the orchard was intact. The same system had survived both extremes. Too little water, then too much. Thomas stood beneath one of the oldest pear trees. "It is not perfect," he said. "No, but it holds." Elena looked across the surviving rows. The summer had taken 21 trees. It had also proven something more important. The orchard did not survive because every part succeeded. It survived because one failure no longer destroyed the whole system. The final inspection took place at the end of summer. Daniel Price arrived with Dr. Bell and 2 county officers. They expected to evaluate a damaged property before foreclosure. Instead, they found most of the orchard still alive. The upper rows had losses, but the restored sections remained green. The contour lines had held through heavy rain, and the soil showed less erosion than the untreated field nearby. Price opened his folder. "How much revenue has the farm produced?" Elena handed him the nursery records. Sales were still modest, but they were real. Young pear trees, grafting stock, and a small amount of compost had created the farm's first positive income in years. Price studied the figures. "This is not enough to repay the full loan." "No," Elena said, "but it is enough to show a working business model." Dr. Bell walked to the first orchard block. He pushed a soil probe into the ground. It passed through the upper layer with little resistance. 3 years earlier, the same tool had stopped after only a few inches. Bell asked for a shovel. Elena handed him one. He dug beside a surviving pear tree and turned over a block of soil. Fine roots crossed the darker upper layer. Small channels extended into the clay below. The soil was not perfect, but it was no longer behaving like the soil described in his original report. Bell examined it carefully. "This is the same field we tested?" "Yes. The structure has changed. So has the way water moves through it." He looked toward the untreated ground beyond the orchard. It was pale, hard, and crossed by fresh runoff marks. Inside the restored section, the surface remained covered and stable. Price joined them. "What exactly are we looking at?" Bell stood. "Reduced runoff, better infiltration, deeper rooting, higher moisture retention." "Does that mean the original report was wrong?" Bell looked at Elena before answering. "The report described the farm accurately, under the conditions that existed then." Elena nodded. "That was the problem." Price frowned. "What problem?" "You treated the conditions as permanent." Silence followed. Bell did not argue. He looked across the orchard, the nursery beds and the restored slope. 3 years earlier, he had concluded that long-term agricultural restoration was economically impractical. Now he was standing inside the evidence that the land could change, not quickly, not without losses, not through one miracle solution, but through a system. The bank approved a revised valuation and extended the loan. It was not forgiveness. It was not victory in the dramatic sense Elena had once imagined. The family still owed money. The orchard still needed years to mature. Another drought could bring new losses. But the farm was no longer being judged only by its failed past. Before leaving, Bell stopped beside the oldest pear tree. "I said deep-rooted trees would not survive here. Under the old conditions, you were probably right." He looked at her. "You are making this easier than it should be." "I was wrong several times, too." She pointed toward the upper rows where empty spaces marked the trees lost during the drought. "The difference is that the land showed me where." Bell smiled slightly. Then he looked down at the soil still clinging to his boots. The experts had come to decide whether the Ward farm still had value. The answer was not hanging from the branches yet. It was beneath their feet. The bank's extension did not erase the debt. It gave the Ward family time. Over the next 2 years, Elena expanded carefully. She planted only where the soil was ready, kept permanent ground cover between the rows, and added new contour sections in small stages. The nursery grew faster than the orchard. Local farmers began buying grafted pear trees selected for hardiness. Later, the Ward family added dried pears, preserves, and small farm tours. No single product saved the farm. The system did. The nursery created early income. The orchard built long-term value. The restored soil reduced water loss. The diversity protected the family when one part underperformed. Some seasons were still difficult. Trees died. Storms damaged overflow points. A late frost destroyed part of one harvest. But the farm no longer depended on one crop, one rain, or one perfect year. Dr. Bell returned several times with students and younger agricultural officers. He never pretended the original report had been careless. Its measurements had been accurate. What changed was his understanding of what those measurements meant. They described the condition of the land. They did not define its future. One autumn morning, Thomas repaired the old rain gauge and placed it near the entrance to the orchard. The cracked glass had been replaced, but the metal frame was still rusted. Elena found him adjusting it beside the first row of mature pear trees. "Still measuring the rain?" she asked. Thomas stepped back. Some habits are worth keeping. The orchard had produced its first meaningful harvest. Golden pears hung from branches that, according to the original assessment, should never have survived long enough to bear fruit. Thomas picked one and handed it to her. "You proved them wrong," he said. Elena looked across the hillside. The contour lines were almost hidden beneath grass and clover now. What had once looked like an experiment had become part of the landscape. "No," she said. "The land proved that it could change." She turned the pear in her hand. "The experts measured how much rain fell." Thomas looked toward the repaired gauge. "And you measured what happened after." The Ward farm never became famous because Elena defeated Drought. She had not. It became valuable because she learned to work with limits instead of denying them. She did not create more rainfall, she slowed it, she spread it, she protected the soil long enough for roots to use it. The land had never been waiting for a miracle, it had been waiting for a different system. Years earlier, the report had declared restoration economically impractical under the existing conditions. That conclusion had been correct in one important way. The farm could not survive by continuing as it had before. What everyone called impossible was not growing pears on the hillside. It was imagining that damaged land could behave differently. Elena imagined it. Then she tested it, failed, adjusted, and built enough small proofs that eventually even the experts had to stand inside the result. At the entrance to the orchard, beneath the old rain gauge, Thomas placed a wooden sign. It carried only one sentence. The rain was never the whole answer.